we're just going to give a couple more minutes for everybody to come in, and then I will hand over to Barry.
While we have a moment, I want to recommend a book. It's the title is Abundance by Ezra Klein, and it provides some very interesting, pragmatic advice with regard to how we approach these planetary scale issues.
Thanks, Jeff. Would you please put it in the chat, and we can hopefully get the
okay, I will do that.
Yeah, I will. Wonderful. So, yeah, Barry, I'm going to hand over to you, and I don't think either Barry or Indy need any introduction, but I will let you do that. Okay, I will try and quieten down. Over to you, Barry.
Okay, hello everyone. Really good to see so many of you on this really important topic. I think that most of us who think about the world recognize that the volume of conflict across the world, violent conflict, has gone up by 65% since 2021. And it's been increasing in different parts of the globe that have never experienced conflict before, which is very troubling. I'm Barry Knight, and I'm going to be the kind of host today. We want to have a participative chat. So I'm going to bring you in after a little while, and you're going to get a chance to address questions to Indy Johar, who's been doing some serious thinking about peace. I've been involved in building peace for 30 years, first cutting my teeth as a volunteer with anti-war action in Serbia in the 1990s, and working in Northern Ireland after that, and with Foundations for Peace and philanthropy for peace and social justice, and very interested in the kind of ability for us to shift the power through the Global Fund for Community Foundations campaign that started in 2017, really looking at what we can all be doing around peace building, not just the peace industrial complex in Geneva. But today we're going to look at we're going to look at the whole planet stuff. And when I first read Indy's piece, it blew my mind. I'm getting feedback here, Tamsin. I don't know what's going on. It blew my mind as being very, different. The idea of planetary preemptive strikes for peace seemed to be a contradictory kind of phrase, which drew my attention to it until I understood a bit more. So I'm going to ask, turn to Indy. Perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, Indy, before we kind of get into the topic today.
Hi, Barry, and Tamsin, and everyone else, for this invitation. I don't come at this from a peace expert perspective. I just want to say this. I come at this from largely working from a systems lens, and looking at both system investing, but also large-scale systems. And the work that we've been doing since 2015 onwards, actually earlier, was largely focused on looking at systems orientation to worldviews. And I built Dark Matter Labs, which is a not-for-profit structure. We work around the planet. There's about 85 of us. Highest paid to lowest paid is 2.1 to 1 ratio, where the highest paid is not derived through management hierarchy. So we're changing the nature of organization. A lot of the work they're doing is looking at large-scale common goods. And by common goods, I mean glacier systems. I mean sort of all the way through to large-scale river systems, to tree canopies of a city, to even material economies as new forms of entangled goods. And this work came from a piece of work we were looking at on glacier systems and the risk to glacier systems and what was happening at the center of them in terms of looking at that. So Barry, delighted to be here, and yeah, in your hands.
Thank you. And Indy, you I believe you qualified initially as an architect. Is that right?
Yeah, no, trained as an architect, so that sort of built my worldview in terms of seeing the world through the kind of act of making, but was part of building the Impact Hub network with supporting people like Jonathan Robinson, built two social investment structures, built OpenDesk, open source furniture company, built WikiHouse, open source housing. And then about 2015, realized that none of this stuff worked because we were still building objects. And actually the problem was land economy, the problem was common goods and other things where the problem space was. And everything we were doing was kind of almost tinkering, putting a flea on the elephant and saying it was a solution, and it really wasn't. So that's where 2015 onwards, we walked into Dark Matter Labs, really working on these forms of common goods and looking at value comes from common goods. And most value is privatized from common goods, and looking at the world, inverting the world view through that lens.
Interesting. And how did the phrase dark matter come into it? I've read some stuff of yours which fascinated me as
Yeah, so what we started to realize was that, and this really, I mean, this is sort of a historical understanding, but when you look at houses and the value of a house, well, the value of a house is attributable not to the house itself. Its value is attributable to job markets, local transportation infrastructures. And if you gave the project of making a cheaper house to an architect, they would just make you a smaller house and say it's a bit cheaper because they've just made you a smaller house. Because we're solving the wrong problem. What we started to realize was that we often solve the problem that's visible, not the system problem, the dark matter problem that sits underneath those things. That if you are going to resolve that, you're going to end up with the wrong solution. So it pained me that whenever you gave an architecture project to homelessness to architects, they would build mobile homes on wheels and say this was the solution of a tent on wheels. And I was like, that is not the solution. That is the solution if all you have is a hammer. Right. But if you look at the dark matter problem, you have to look back at actually other forms of value at the back end of the system. So that's really how we kind of sort of evolved into it. And dark matter labs is now like finance people, lawyers, activists. We got it's a whole hybrid of skills. We're not.
Right. So it's really looking at the core of the systems issue, isn't it? Going in at the point where you really need to make the difference rather than skimming the surface and getting the answer wrong. Tell me, where did the phrase preemptive strikes for peace come from?
Yeah. So I alluded to this earlier. We were asked to look at key planetary goods. And the ones we were looking at a whole 16 of them actually, but one of them we started to look at was glacier systems. And if you look at glacier systems in, say, the Himalayas or in other parts of the world, what you realize is that our glacier systems are systemically destabilizing. So Alps will lose its glaciers by 2070, which means that you'll lose predictable water systems. Himalayas has other forms of glacier loss in those environments. 3.5 billion people rely on the watershed of those glacier systems in the Himalayas. It is the intersection of at least 3 nuclear powers. And you also realize that actually what you're seeing is not glacier loss. The destabilization of those ecosystems and water systems actually creates a concoction of degenerative volatility. I'm using this term. Volatility is usually the spiking up and down, but degenerative volatility is if the baseline is falling at the same time. And what we've now got is that ecological systems are not just volatile, which is also increasing, the volatility is increasing, but there's a systemic degeneration going on. And the degeneration is creating micro instability in every layer of the system. So whether it's pressure points in terms of water, pressure points in terms of food systems, pressure points in terms of loss of crops, pressure points of and what you find is it's the systemic volatility in society that creates this tipping point behavior into potential flashpoints for systemic violence. And because this is watershed, a critical foundational economy for 3.5 billion people, what you realize is this is the kind of environment that is both vulnerable to cascading violence and also cascading violence that unfurls, and is also a point of vulnerability to that whole region systematically. So if any one party is excluded from that water because it's an existential crisis, they would almost certainly be incentivized to use just large-scale destructive weapons into those systems. So if you look at the game scenario of this is a scenario that leads us to mutually assured destruction. And it's a game scenario that you can model out and you see it falling into that pathway with the power that's available. And based on that game scenario, what you start to realize that there is only one viable path that avoids mutually assured destruction is finding a new form of regenerative peace strike in advance of falling into systemic mutual volatility and destruction. And what became clear to us that there was a critical locations around the world that preemptive peace strikes were the only option available in order to avoid mutually assured destruction. And those locations are glacier systems, but there are also other forms of critical systems that are so vital to ecological foundational economies that we have to actually start to think of them. This also opens up, I think, a pathway for transnational governance. Because as we know, the river Danube was the source of international water. That's where international waters was born after conflict, the Danube River conflict. So if we can start to build new forms of transnational governance, which is not just about conservation, because you cannot conserve these systems, you have to regenerate these systems. So they have to be transnational developmental institutions. You can start to create a new form of architecture for transnational cooperation for mutually assured thriving in the face of mutually assured destruction. So these locations are opening up, which I think offer us a pathway to planetarity as an emergent phenomena as opposed to an imposed phenomena. And it's arising out of mutual interest in the ground. And I think what we're seeing is this is going to be quite critical in terms of moving forward. One other thing I'd say is that you don't need to have a water crisis to have this effect. As soon as you perceive the risk of water as a crisis, actually, and by that perception, as soon as you experienced it, as soon as you see it as a strategic threat, at that moment in time, it becomes critical because it's a perception moment when the risk is understood, does this existential crisis manifest on the ground? So that's where it came from. That's the logic space, but we see it becoming a key pathway to systemic security and building a new class of regenerative institutions at a planetary scale, opening up in a moment when we're disbanding and unbanding our planetary institutions.
Interesting, because what that perspective does, it seems to me, Indy, is it transforms the idea of peace building from a reactive issue in which institutions respond almost when it's too late, to one in which you're actually on the front foot and you're being proactive. And that's giving a kind of an agenda and giving peace building a greater status in the world, because at the moment it's a sense it's people respond, and it's almost who's there, who can do what, and rather than actually doing something about it, directly. And I mean, the reference I always think about is Christopher Clark's book on the origins of the First World War, which simply happened but through a series of chain events, and nobody really wanted it to happen. It was just the system was so it hadn't actually anticipated the notion of actually building peace, and it drifted into war. In the book is called The Sleepwalkers, and if you haven't read it, it's one of the best history books ever written because of that. But there are so many lessons there. Could you give us an example what a preemptive planetary strike for peace would actually look like? What would be, who would do this? How would it work? What would it consist of?
I think this is a work to be done and to be designed. I think what it does require is all key stakeholders to recognize the game theory of mutually assured destruction. Weirdly enough, it starts by recognizing the systemic vulnerability mutually. Once you can actually recognize the vulnerability, then you can leave the only choice available is mutually assured thriving. And I think there's a sort of game theory response that has to be worked through. The other thing is this actually is rooted in systemic security. So you have to work with the security infrastructure of those environments. And then I think what's really interesting is the security infrastructure is now starting to understand volatility in society as a systemic risk. So social breakdown as a systemic risk to preserving the social contract and preserving asset theory and value. So I think it requires a really diligent move through, but it comes from a security perspective and a defense perspective upwards into this conversation of peace in quite a different way. And then the solution space is completely different. It's about artificial glacier preservation. It's about new forms of governance spaces. It's about ecological restoration, regenerative transformation, and moving landscapes up to about 100 miles north or south, depending on where you are. Then the solution landscapes, and it might even involve dynamic hydrological management of the water systems in really radical ways, but it requires building the treaties and the landscapes and the new diplomacy landscapes for that landscape, for that theory. So it comes, I think you have to root it in security to get people's minds into the space. That's what we're seeing.
So security is the key word here. Yeah, thank you.
And with security, Barry, what I say is, I think what I'm seeing is that there's what I call the 19th century idea of security, which is the bounded idea of security. The UK can be secure in its boundary. The reality is it's not true. So UK cannot be secured in its boundary because if we lose the Amazon, we're all dead. So what we're starting to realize is security is both a boundary problem, it's a systems problem, and an entanglement problem. And there are some things which we can no longer be decoupled from. The UK cannot be decoupled from the Amazon. And I think the more we recognize from a security landscape that this is a non-decouplable event, you start to create a different theory of politics and also a different theory of alliances rooted in mutual security, as opposed to power over, but as in power with, because this is a mutually assured, needs a mutually sort of combined way. So I think even the word security needs to be rebundled. And I think this is a really important moment because I think we're living in the illusion of bounded, decoupled security. And I think that illusion is being peddled by people who are asking for a 19th century theory of freedom, not recognizing the systemic coupling that exists on the biophysical level because of the nature of the planet, the planetary relationships we're in. So I think we're seeing this politics of 19th century freedoms versus actually fully entangled environments coming into force in a really radical way. And that's why the word of security needs to be rebundled to build out to preemptive peace. Sorry, Barry, I apologize for I just thought it'd be helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. No, I mean, I think that's an essential corollary to what you said before. I mean, I guess having worked with somebody I see on the call, my friend Emma Playfair, recently on helping put together a book that Basma Kodamani, the great kind of Syrian diplomat, tried to build peace in Syria, and looking at the performance of the great powers around that issue. I have no reason to be optimistic that anybody will take this seriously because, what's very clear is that in diplomacy, people tend to take their own self-interest and package it up as an altruistic solution when it's not. And do you think that given the state of our realpolitik, that we can find a way to actually get some of the great powers as they are to listen to this and see some kind of sense, because it involves an imaginative leap that I'm not sure they're capable of.
I think I don't think we're far away from that leap, but we differ. So I think rooting this through a lens of security and entangled security is actually bridging a landscape for the left and right to come together because it actually roots it in existential survival. Second, I think what we're seeing is increasingly the instability pathways at a planetary scale are so large. And I think this is one of the big risks that we face, is I think current major powers, specifically one, perceives that the world is more resilient than many other people think it is. So it can offload a whole bunch of risks at a planetary scale with low level of feedback. And so the US current presidency perceives that the world can absorb more risk than many of us think is possible. We know there's 50 nations that are very fragile right now, that I think even tariffs will actually break apart the viability of those nations and actually drive social unrest. Now, I think So I think one, we need to expand the theory of security with them. Two, my intuitive pathway, and this is just me talking amongst friends, I expect that the major powers to come together parallelly to create a parallel security council, a different format, and then talk about a world security bank. And I think it will come through almost a financing infrastructure for preserving systemic security and stability in systems as a key intervention space, because it assures the powers that be able to preserve their wealth and viability in the current framework. I think that's the politics that will open this landscape up in a different way. And I would argue that there are certain nations like to perceive that risk and stability risk at a systemic level. So, and again, this is conjecture, this is the politics, and it's a piece of projection. So I'm not basing this on fact, but I share this amongst friends for discussion, dialogue, debate, and making better.
Thank you. I mean, that's what do you now intend? How do you now intend to sort of take the next steps on this? And what would you want from the kinds of people that are on this call, Indy? How can we get this idea? What can we do to help you move to the next stage around this?
Well, I mean, not just for me, but I think this is important. And I think you can look at this at a planetary level, like glacier systems. You can also look at it at key watershed levels in key locations, Angola, like you can pick out locations. I think us understanding these sensitivity locations, us being able to talk about how do you build preemptive peace strikes and be able to build the new institutions. So we're talking, for example, between South Africa and Zimbabwe around actually building a transnational park conservation bank for transnational park that's being built around how to conserve and enhance that. So these transnational locations, I think, are a great location for building new planetary relationships and new planetary institutions. I think the design of these institutions is going to be really critical. They're going to be rooted in new types of monetary economics and new types of allocation mechanisms, and will be semi-automated and verified in different ways. The diplomacy infrastructure of this has to be reimagined in different ways. There is so much work. And I think the incentive to do this work is significant. So I don't certainly claim any territory here. I am pointing to a space that requires many people's work and requires multiple forms of innovation. But I think there are incentives to do that work at speed. And I think transnational alliances and transnational investments into this will become significant now.
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to. The people are putting some really interesting comments in the chat. Please do continue with that, because I think that's really adds to this kind of discussion. We will, of course, be writing this up, and the recording will be available to people. So we need to kind of develop this. I wonder whether we could start. I could turn to people on the call to ask questions. Andrew Kelly, anything on the? You put some stuff in the chat, I believe. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure, thank you.
Come to Louis after you, yeah. Go, Andrew.
Thank you for today. This is tremendous. The comments on the Amazon and Himalayas pair with my experience in Antarctica. I've recently left the Antarctic Science Foundation, based here in Australia. So it's the middle of the night joining you here tonight. But this discussion is really important because we are largely, as a species, unaware of the impact that we are having on these complex systems of systems. And we are seeing this in Antarctica. The Thwaites Glacier in the West Antarctic is unstable. Antarctica represents a significant amount of sea level rise. Should those glaciers let go, even now we're modelling sea level rises of between 3 centimetres and 50 to 80 centimetres within the next 80 years. That puts billions of people at risk in coastal areas. Also, the the work of the Southern Ocean in remediating carbon to the seabed is now at risk. The circumpolar current around Antarctica is slowing as oceans heat. Species in oceans are now moving a kilometre per year away from the equator, and all of these changes that are in train are from person-made impact on nature. So I certainly endorse Indy's comments, and it is really important to bring this impact of yes, it's a massive globe that we have, but we are making these changes, and we're certainly seeing them in Antarctica.
Thank you, Andrew. That's very helpful, and I'm glad that you feel that way. Louis, you've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute and
Yes.
ask your question?
I did the unmuting bit already. Thank you so very much, and it's very timely. And again, in these spaces here, we meet people over and over again, and it's good to see how our collective and shared thinking and understanding moves into similar directions. I'd like to share one experience and one resonance. The experience is that out of the House of Beautiful Business gathering in Tangier last year, grew an initiative, a Middle East Peace and Prosperity Initiative, which brings together civic diplomacy and to focus on a resilient and regenerative civil society. It started with a Middle East treaty organization where peace activists really managed to get into diplomacy and establish a round table at the United Nations on nuclear disarmament in the Middle East, which is sort of the UN definition of 24 countries from Mauritania and Morocco in the west to Iran in the east and down to in the south to Somalia. And out of these 24, 23 regularly meet at the United Nations to look at nuclear disarmament in the Middle East and beyond. So that is one part, civic diplomacy, that is already underway and waits for support and further activities. And to combine that with the idea, not only peace, but also prosperity, to see what are the capabilities and capacities of civil society for it to care for its own resilience and regenerativity. And this is a point that brings us back to the beautiful session that we had with Lucy Bernhardt on what is actually the role of philanthropy in that space. And I'd like to go back to emphasize that again, to use your capabilities and capacities to connect and move away from the single by single project, single by single actor in the field, but reaching out to each other to facilitate the connections between all those who are in the fields and caring for resilience and regenerativity in civil society already. To not fall in the trap that we think we have to start something from scratch again and build a new movement, but to use our capabilities to reach out to each other and then grow from the core reflection of lived experience, a shared understanding of what our agency or collective agency is in that, and what openings we see for collective action. And that is very much where I see Indy pointing a way to say this is what needs to come together. the capacities and capabilities that we have in the space already, and a sense of ownership, care, agency to do that out of the midst of civil society, and not waiting for any kind of politics or politicians offering that to us at the end of the day. But the moment is now. I think I'll leave it here.
Thank you, Louis. Do you want to comment at all on that, Indy? There are a few comments in the chat. I'd like to draw on some of those if people want to put their hands up. Those of you who have put comments in the chat, it'd be great to hear your voices. Indy, did you want to respond to?
Yeah,
Louis?
I mean, not just Louis, but also Andrew. I think you're absolutely right. I think yes, we need to build on what we're doing, but we also need to shift the terms. I think the security conversation, the reason why I'm having it, is because I can construct a new type of bridging politic. And I can also hopefully expand that security to re-entangle in some way. So actually not just the kind of decoupling narratives, but find a way back up that chain. So what's the framing? And then also I think it's really critical, as was mentioned in the chat, this is not just about water. Yes, water is one vulnerability. As you rightly pointed out, there are other systemic vulnerabilities in terms of soil. We know the Syria crisis, the role of soil and climate degradation on soil had in terms of actually scaling up the volatility in that environment and laying a pathway that we've experienced. So I think this offers many more domains. I also think it has a new economic logic to it, because security economics is fundamentally different from traditional market fixed economics theory, and thereby the construction of peace has a different economic value into that chain, into a different conversation. I think exactly as Andrew was pointing out, whether it's the Antarctica in terms of loss of critical ice sheets and how do we preserve them, this for me is a sort of systemic planetary crisis level bundling of institutions that need to be built. And I think the construction of a new politic around this will be a key part of that story and will require new types of institutions. And these institutions cannot be just about the conservation of a system. It's no longer enough to just leave things alone. Every landscape in the world, as a result of climate change, will be moving 100 miles north, 100 miles south. Simultaneously, glacier systems are not stable anymore. So it is active regeneration, active stabilization, which means that these institutions are about agreement spaces, which are many-to-many agreement spaces, but also about allocation. It's about new forms of developmental banks, which are rooted in the regeneration of these systems and the preservation of them against systemic volatility. So it's new institutions, new political frames, and also looking at the foundational frameworks more than water. Just want to go through a few of the comments.
Thank you very much, Indy. Jerry, you've got your hand up. Unmute yourself, Jerry. You're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry. Indy, it's a question for you. One of the things that strikes me is that all these cataclysmic things that we are anticipating are going to happen are going to sort of unravel, and they will unravel, and people who may not believe or may not be on board are going to be increasingly looking to how do they get, how do they react? How do they behave? How do they learn more about things? And I'm just wondering if we have enough information in a sort of simple, straightforward way that can be shared with people as they begin to recognize the kind of crisis that you're talking about. Because it seems to me that there will be a surge. The question is that surge going to be manageable unless we start preparing guides or idiot guides or whatever it is for people that allow them to come on board and to come on board in ways that make sense for them? I can't imagine this being done without everybody pulling together in the end, whether it's people who are with us now or who will be with us in the near future. I'll
Uh,
stop.
no, I think that's absolutely fair. So I think we have to unbundle a few myths. And the number one myth I sort of started unbundling was what I used to call the New Zealand strategy for wealth, which is basically I will build a little bunker in New Zealand and I'll go and live there, and that will be my safety system, i.e., the idea that you could decouple your safety from the planet. And one of the great ways to unbundle that myth is to say, great, New Zealand in COVID did not have penicillin, did not have pharmaceuticals, did not have paracetamol because they had no production capability. In fact, Europe did not have any paracetamols because it built nothing in Europe. We didn't have any pharma production capabilities in terms of paracetamol. So the level of planetary entanglement means that actually, yes, you can escape to New Zealand, but without antibiotics. So once you start to realize that systemically you are coupled, your theory of wealth cannot be about separationism, but has to move to managing systemic risk as a key part of wealth management. And I'm using wealth management as a kind of, if your wealth management strategy, if you are really trying to manage wealth, there is no decoupling strategy left. And if you acknowledge that, then you work into managing systemic risks as a key part of your wealth management strategy. And that, as a fractal approach, goes all the way up. And the other part that I think is really important for us to narrate and attack, in my view, it's a sort of virus that sits in people's heads. When I talk to people with significant wealth, one of the questions I often get is, but indeed, there's only space in the earth for about 1 billion people. And that, to me, is a really dangerous language, because in that language, we've discounted 7.3 billion people and accepted their being terminated. And what I also try to communicate to them very cleanly is that the reality is, once we start along a cascading theory of war, there is no pathway for us to stop that because of bioweapons, nuclear weapons, dirty nukes, information systems, biocontagion, all of that stuff. And the level of CO2 we're going to release, remember, our war machine is not booked into our CO2 levels. It becomes a self-terminating path. So as long as we can start to see that the cascading pathways drop us into that reality, you start to imagine a different path as the only viable path available to us. And that's what I'm trying to do, is block those what I call decoupling narratives and those what I'd call we will stop narratives. If you can take those out, those kind of, in my view, and it's a view again, I think this needs to be further researched and proven. In my view, you can't stop the cascade once it kicks off. And I think we have to put those backstops in to then allow to build for a different conversation. I don't know if that sort of came across to your question.
Thank you, Indy, and thank you, Jerry. Samantha, you've put an interesting point, I think, into the chat. Would you like to either make a comment about it or ask a question?
Yes, I was actually putting in a second comment, so I could touch on both.
Yeah, you go for both. Yeah, yeah.
So
Make Indy work hard. That's that's what we're gonna have to do today.
yeah. So I'm responding to Louis. I caught his contribution and I thought it was a good summary. And I was really excited, at the conclusion that he said that I have observed as well, that there's coming from different paths. We're all coming to this conclusion that we do need this agency. We need to build this agency through collective action and alignment. So my question is, the vision is inspiring and I'm inspired, but I'm also curious why we haven't done it. And are we aware of why we haven't done it? And are we building this utopian model for collaboration without sort of paying attention to the reasons why this isn't happening. And so that also builds into my second question. And here I was responding to Indy, because the idea of entanglement is, I guess, is a topical one. After COVID, it became very real. And so I can only speak from my context. I live in Kenya, that's Nairobi. And so in my context, how we interpreted COVID was it was a leveler within our small context. Those who had more resources and access to resources, and those who didn't, we found ourselves sort of in the same situation. And so this then brings that idea of entanglement to fore, and the example of New Zealand and trying to remove yourself from this situation so that you can have, your own little bubble where these things don't affect you. I think it was proven that it might not make sense based on how our economies are currently structured. But my question is, or my second comment is, there are bad actors. And in as much as we're getting this awakening and we are all excited and we want to do work together, there are bad actors and they do have access to considerable resources. And they have considerable ability to mobilize for their agendas. And this is why war happens. And so does our vision account for this? And are we designing without looking at these inconvenient truths?
Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. That's a really erudite contribution. Indy, how do you respond to that?
I'd invite some other people to respond to some of that because I think it's a broader question to all of us. So I want to one part I just wanted to acknowledge was where we saw the gaps. So, for example, much of this work requires security clearances, security relationships, trusted intermediaries between multiple security relationships. So 3 countries, do they trust a counterparty? What is their kind of, so it requires both the relationships and the institutions. So, for example, the problem that our UN system is rooted in, our UN system is rooted in nation states. So it doesn't build the transnational infrastructure for that security alliances. So I think there's just practical things. Also, many of us that have come from what I'd call the humanitarian space haven't been rooted in the security space in the same way. So I think there's a sort of gap of comprehension, language, and relationships, and also the clearances, if I'm really honest, to operate with that knowledge, and also the institutional forms to operate with that knowledge. And how do we actually preserve good institutional logic? So one of the things we were worried about was how could we hold this knowledge and how could we operate it? What's our integrity? How do we build the governance to operate this? This felt like all from our position felt like new work. And I know there's security organizations that do that sort of work, but from our side, we saw that as a systemic gap in terms of our capabilities. We could design the institutions, but there was a whole bunch of work there. But I think there was Samantha, I think there's a whole bunch of questions for many of us in the room. So I'd also encourage other people to come in on some of those as well.
Yeah, let's do that. Who'd like to respond to Samantha's question? Because I think that gets at the heart of a lot of what we need to think about and why have we gone wrong here? Who'd like to go? Stick your hand up, please. I can't imagine all this lot are so shy. Louis, you're back again. Do come have another go.
Oh, well, yes. Shyness is not my faculty. What I recognize in the space, and leaning not to qualifying people or what they do and how they do it, but more so looking into our agent, is the recognizing that we are absolutely entitled to give ourselves permission to do so, to do a next step, to reach out to each other. At this point, I like to share an experience from a conference where I was sort of in charge of facilitating the whole thing, sort of leading from one part of the day to the other for the entire week. And every time, morning, noon, closing in the afternoon, I invited people to reach out to each other, looking for people that they do not know, ask them how they were and what brought them to the space. And it was not much, but to recognize how little was what it took to change the overall dynamic of the space and the connectivity of the people present, as to move from, and probably what we just experienced, that what you call Barry shyness, is an element of that, to say, how can we give ourselves and each other the permission to reach out to each other? And we're back to all kinds of activism on the one hand, but more so growing a shared understanding about our possibilities, about our capabilities for collective action, and move on from there. And that is my resonance to Samantha, to really take it from where we are and reach out in that kindness, gentleness, softness to each other, to do the first step, out of which more can grow in terms of understanding, but also in terms of action and activism and whatever kind of movement.
Thank you, Louis. Deirdre, you put a really interesting question in the chat. Would you like to speak to that? Because that takes us into an interesting direction, I think.
Thanks, Barry. And thanks so much, Indy. It's a pleasure to be in an actual live conversation with you rather than listening to you after the fact. I always love the provocations that you stir in me. I think you already largely answered the question about this expanding beyond water, but my mind is still going on the question of the bridge from where we are at current to this place, this future imagined state that you're naming. And I'm wondering about two things. One is, the only thing that's coming to mind for me is ego, right? So how do we manage the space in a way that brings everyone into a knowing of this shared mutual destruction? Because there truly are actors in the world, and maybe this links to the question that was asked just now. But what is the work of that, of sort of bringing people into this shared understanding of mutual destruction or mutual thriving? And then I'm thinking about sort of the real context on the ground. I don't know why Africa is coming to mind, but I'm thinking about the vast array of conflicts that are unfolding across the continent, and that if we break them down to source, there are myriad different influences that are fueling them. And so I'm wondering, even if we understand this framework as relating to different sources, is there a way that we can, across a range of issues, tackle the question of security shifts in the way that you're talking about? Or does it have to happen issue by issue? Because if we're talking about food and soil, that's a different grouping of people that's engaged there to if we're talking about water. How do we prevent this issue, especially if we're taking a systems approach to it, from becoming something that splinters us by field? How do we think about it in a deeply intersectional way? And practically, in terms of sort of initial steps, that's sort of what's going around in my head. And part of it might be the role of philanthropy, but I sort of want to even come before that, because philanthropy sort of tries to come in with solutions. And I really want to step back and think about, what does it look like practically, the unfolding of this bridge from where we are at present to where we might be? That's what's been going around in my head. And it's not specifically for you, Indy, but a provocation that's sort of coming up for me as I sit here.
That's a really great point of view, Deirdre, and a real great challenge to us to actually think, because there is not one size fits all. We are dealing with a whole range of different issues in different places. So that's really important. I'm going to get to Andrew Kelly in a bit, if you can speak. I'm going to go to Cara first because she's got first in the queue. But some of the points that you made, I think, are relevant to what Deirdre has just asked, which I don't want to lose that, Deirdre, because I think that's great. But Cara, you're next.
Yeah, I've been thinking and seeing as part of the Evolutionary Leaders Network, what is that path that gets us from where we are to a world that works for everyone, where we're thriving? And I really, what I can see and perceive sort of emerging from the field, and what excites me and brings me alive, is that it's really up to us as the conscious co-creative people who are having these conversations, who are asking these questions, who want to build this stuff, that we actually need to build the new system that we want to see, by creating our own currency, by creating our own businesses that can earn billions of dollars. Like Google it was only 10 or 20 years ago that it didn't even exist, or maybe a little more, but and now it's got billions of dollars. If we can have that same kind of entrepreneurial spirit as these systems changer, and put together our story of how we can create a system that gives people a different option away from like game A, as many people call it, and give them a game B that's viable using technology and currencies and that kind of thing, then we actually shift the power so that the bad actors don't have the power anymore, but we've built it up through ourselves. So I have I'm going to talk about this tomorrow. If anyone's interested, they can text, they can chat me, and I can invite them. And it's how are we becoming love organized, and I can see it in sort of phases that we can build it up in a bioregional kind of way. So I really think it's up to us. I think philanthropy has a part, and we have a part, and governments have like a small part, but I don't think they're the ones who can do it, because they're too entrenched in the current system. They're trying to keep that system going that's falling, and they're too busy to create the new system that makes their own system obsolete. So I think it's really up to us to get together, and I think we can find funding to get it going, and then build up exponentially over time.
Well, I think that's a really important point, Cara, that actually so much of the money goes into keeping the system going, so much of the effort, that actually there is very little a capacity to think about what could be different and how could it be different, because people are just going on a single stream that they're actually paid for, rather than actually thinking alternatives. I suggest that if people are interested in Cara's session tomorrow, that you send her a message in the chat and give you get her your details so she can invite you. I mean, there's been a couple of mentions of philanthropy. Andrew, I noticed you were skeptical about philanthropy as being much of a resource in this field. Would you like to add to that, and actually maybe make some of the other points that you've made in the chat? Andrew Kelly, it's back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Barry. I've worked in philanthropy for 25 years and in a number of different fields, from refugees, kids at risk, education, medical research, Antarctic environmental research, and it does great work. But I think we need to be realistic here. If we can use it for seed funding to build communities of change, that's great. But it is complicit in its accumulation, and it is it will be difficult to convince large-scale philanthropy to do the work that needs to be done. That's not a popular opinion, and I'd like it to be otherwise, but frankly, that's what I've seen over a quarter of a century. So we are asking people, and very powerful people, to mop up the problems that they've caused and, as you've said, maintained. So I think we need to be real about it. I believe what we need as a species is a complete mind shift in what it means to be, to accumulate, what it means to display, and what it means to be successful. As I said in the chat before, I really do believe that until we can get to a point where we say that how little you took from the earth and how little you took from other people is a success rather than the other way around. We are not going to be able to create meaning in our own lives so that we can then understand the connection that we have with our natural home, which is Earth. And frankly, people talk about saving the planet. Planet's going to be fine. We need to save ourselves. It's just that simple. And until we can find meaning in our connections with ourselves, with others, and with nature, then this is not going to work. So what's the solution? We actually need, it's very countercultural. We need communities like are on this call right here to connect as we are. And then we need to model this, and we need to have these conversations, and we don't bring everybody with us. We don't shout. We don't argue. We just model the behaviors that are more attuned to the world that we want and the world that we need, and are connected to nature. I believe that is the only way we're going to go. I have the top 300 climate scientists in my phone. I can call any one of them to ask them what's going on or what's happening or what's changing, and they all tell me the same thing. So we don't actually need any more science to act. All of the research that's been done and is being done is giving us precision, but we don't need any more science to act. And so therefore it is up to us. And ultimately, when I look at my child and future generations, they will say, what did you know and how did you act given what you knew?
Thank you, Andrew. That's a very cautionary reminder to our conscience to actually think about this. Hannah, you've put a really interesting comment in the chat around magic bullets and the lack of them, and suggests we need hard work. Would you like to elaborate on that and maybe share some of the thoughts that Deirdre and others have kind of set out, and the challenge that actually there is no easily available kind of finance for this? Hannah, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Barry, for inviting me into the conversation. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Sorry for being on the phone. Thank you for this wonderful discussion and for bringing us to this level of alignment. Listening into to you, to your provocations, and we've known each other for quite some time. And it seems that everyone is waiting for this magic wand, like give us this wand, give us this thing that will just redesign the system, which will help us move forward, but it doesn't exist, and we know this. And your level of thinking is the third horizon, or sometimes I'm even calling it the fourth horizon. So really up in the skies, which is guiding us, which is giving us this inspiration and this pathway of what's possible, of what needs to change. But at the same time, we need different energies, and there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and we just need to acknowledge this. So I really agree that that coming as community, starting modeling this behavior, this is what needs to happen, because there will be no magic wands. There will be no one person, one individual coming up and saying, this is how we can redesign the systems. Because in the end, the vision is decentralized communities, giving power back to communities, being aligned with nature, being aligned with each other. And there will be a myriad of answers to the questions we're trying to answer here. So yes, that's why we have a little bit of impatience, and this is clear. The moment is very urgent, and is calling upon us to come up with ideas, with solutions. But there is no easy answer to that. And there are different level of engagements, and also, and this is coming from systems thinking, that we have different type of energies and different type of roles in the systems. Also, some of us are great resource generators, people who can really convince other people and institutions to generate funding, to generate support. Some of us are great visionary thinkers like India, who have ideas which some people have not even imagined or thought of, and then bring these energies together to actually showcase what's possible, and also acting on the change. And what is very close to my heart and very connected with the conversations we are having, also connected with peace and the role of philanthropy, is the role that futures thinking is playing in this, and really reclaiming the agency, giving us back this agency, and learning from futures, from foresight work, how we can focus not only on the current moment and what is broken, because I think that we have an alignment that the systems are broken, that the economic system is challenged from all sides. People are unhappy, feeling not being part of the conversation. So there are really a lot of signs of things not working, but it's not giving us the energy to actually move forward. We need to have this longer term vision. We need to have ideas of what this different world, community driven world could look like. And then modeling this visions and showcasing that this is happening. And the last point I would add, Barry, is there are many, many examples of this work already happening, and this is the good news. And I'm sure that even in this room, if we start collecting these insights of this different world already emerging, we will have many, many of the examples. They're just not that visible, maybe not that connected, maybe not as resourced as they deserve to be resourced. But this is the work we need to do to get to this planetary vision of being united, being connected with each other, with communities, with nature.
Thank you, Hannah. Very, very smart response. Thank you very much. And just to add to that, Hannah and I have been working together on trying to involve philanthropy more in peace building. And one of the things that she said there, I think is very important, is I did a survey last year on what philanthropy was actually doing. And when you collate the results, actually it's very piecemeal, but there's a lot of it. And what I think is we need to kind of bring that together and actually bring that into a more coordinated package about what is possible, because one of the reasons why philanthropy doesn't engage in this is it really doesn't know what to do sometimes, and it doesn't understand the context, and it's quite frightened of getting into areas where it doesn't understand what the stakes are, and we need to kind of work to kind of change that around. And we need to remember that philanthropy is not a homogeneous thing, because I think there's a real power in community philanthropy. And there are some people on this call who are involved in community philanthropy, which is grassroots work at the very grassroots level. I'd like to ask Chandrika Sahai, who coordinates a group called Foundations for Peace, around that is actually works at grant makers at very local level, whether you'd like to contribute to this discussion. How would Chandrika brings together regularly people who are very much on the front lines of conflicts, community activists, people engaged in the day-to-day kind of conflict on the at the sharp end of that. Chandrika, would you like to kind of comment on how you see this, preemptive strikes for peace, and how would that work? Given particularly Deirdre's comment about the variations of different kinds of conflicts, and there isn't one route into this.
Thank you, Barry. I don't know, really. This has given me a lot of food for thought, and I agree a lot with Hannah. And people have different roles in the system, and India has really, has got one of those roles where you bring new ideas that people have never thought of, and this is something that I had never thought of living in my own bubble. But the grassroots philanthropies and the peace activists that I work with, I think in their own way. I mean, not a lot of the people that I work with are, they're recognizing or working with vulnerabilities like water and soil. I think their vulnerabilities right now that are very alive for them are more related to human issues. I think the concept of preemptive strikes, it does, I think it does resonate with that group, because um, I think the idea that Indy talked about entanglements, not, well, maybe we're not talking so explicitly in my group about entanglements with the planet and with nature and with different ecosystem, but our entanglements as people and as, in our relationships and as sort of communities, that's very alive in the conversations that I'm having. So, for them, a preemptive strike for peace would be about building social cohesion. And, I guess in one way that, they would differ a little bit from the progressive agenda that is about surfacing how the other side is harming, their economy, their community, or the planet. But they would highlight the entanglements and say that how much more alike we are and how we can sort of find the moral imagination to get along. And imagine they would be, they talk about that moral imagination that John Paul Lederach talks about, that can you imagine yourself in a relationship with your enemies? Can you imagine a future with your enemies? And I think that is a preemptive strike for peace as well. So I guess that's where I'd come in.
Thank you, Chandrika. Godelieve, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but you've made an interesting couple of points in the chat. Would you like to elaborate on them?
Well, just very briefly, I'm for the first time in this call. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. It was absolutely great to join in, and you made my day. Indy, thanks very much for your intervention. Absolutely. I come in from a planetary health / NGO / medical / political / background. So I've made a bit of, in my personal life, a bit of a march through the institutions, and I have felt already for quite a long time that what is being discussed here, the emergence of, on so many fronts at once, the necessity of real fundamental change. So this resonates on so many levels. My background in the political spheres has always made me very aware of what pulls us back. So Samantha's question really resonated with me when you said, well, how come we're not getting to a next stage enough? At the same time, and so on Monday, I always say I see all these things emerging, so many people in so many circuits. And here's a circuit, a group of people in the sciences, in climate, who start to embrace these new questions and awarenesses. I see it in the arts. I see it also in the political arena. I see it in the established institutions where a lot of people are also lost for words now. They don't know where to go anymore. So this is a moment of chaos. Collective chaos, which can fall massively back or it can fall forward. I see it really as a sort of a very, very crucial point. And we cannot make everything in a 5-year plan or whatever. Things will emerge, but we can probably support cultivation grounds for the new. So this type of encounter where we talk to each other, where we find the words, I heard so many words that were resonated, where we recapture words or reclaim words that have been hijacked, where we make new spaces for conversation is super vital. So what I get from a call like this is this, again, the hopeful side that there is many more people out there than we think. And when Indy was saying in his intervention that you think that some sort of tipping point or some sort of point of moving forward rather than backward might be on the horizon. I have the same feeling. If you walk around the streets of life, you actually see in so many places that people are busy with the struggle and realize that it's not good enough anymore. And so there are all kinds of starting points. Now, the hard work is how to connect, and find the spaces for that. And then the hard connection, of course, is moving to institutional spaces where more of this can happen. And the few fights that I would like to engage in personally myself is fighting those forces that try to pull us back, or try to pull back to whatever the established destructive, extractive arenas are. So those are the fights. But the making of the new is also happening at the same time. And everybody in their personal lives will probably have to decide, am I going to be on the side of the pro or the con, or where do I find myself? So I was just reacting to some comments, to Indy's comments in particular, about when he said there's all this hard systemic work to do. I feel we need to create the spaces for the new governance as well. And new governance is all these new forms of connections, all these new forms of thinking about power relations. And in the current climate, the shadows of the old regime and the spasms of the old regimes are so big that sometimes you get desperate. But then I try to go to spaces where I see the new is there, and here you are, So you made my day. Thanks, Barry, for the invite. And so this is more like a flow of reflections, but
well, let's hope we can continue this. We're starting here. I think there is a coherence that's emerging from this discussion. Faizan, you said you may have to go, and you've put some interesting points in the chat. You also said you've got kids there that and difficulty with noise, but I'd love to hear from you if you're still on the call. Are you there? Oh, sorry, still screams, he says. Oh well, that's so. Shall we? Anybody else like to kind of make a contribution before I'm going to turn back over to
Mike has a question. Mike has a question.
Oh, Mike, please, Mike. Sorry, I missed you.
I don't know if it's a question or a reflection, but while I've been listening to this, a couple of things. One, interesting, just the call immediately before this was talking about the northwest region of Namibia, the Kanene region. And it's quite an amazing region. There's the only free-ranging black rhino in the world, desert lion, desert elephant, and there's mining. And that mining could destroy a lot of stuff. And one of the first thoughts is, well, all those NGOs, if there's a collective voice, it can be stronger. And the response is, get all those NGOs together, it's just impossible. There's so many different agendas. Even the good guys are different. So it's easy to say, and I see so often it's hard to do. And going through that to something else, a book by Arish Sharma, I can't remember the lady's name, it was Leading from the Emerging Future. And they start off by talking about the 3 disconnects. We are disconnected from our environment, we're disconnected from each other, and we're disconnected from ourselves. And that disconnect from ourselves, as I've been listening to all of this, just really resonates. And you've seen it. I mean, the biggest cause, I think, is of, was it 28 to 45-year-old kids dying in the States is suicide. Australia's a huge issue. We're disconnected from each other. So how are we going to get all together? Because when we're fighting each other, and isn't the work, and I love the idea these preemptive strikes for peace. There's no peace within us, in ourselves. And that issue is getting, it seems to me, it's getting more and more acute. So are we I guess the question is, are we trying to jump a couple of steps?
Interesting point, Mike. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about that, which is how what goes on the inside is reflected on the outside and vice versa. And actually a lot of, if you think about the nature of consciousness and the findings of quantum mechanics, which are now 100 years old, which is actually we make the universe from within our own consciousness. So that in a sense we need, I think, to think about what is it to be human and how do we actually find a a new and expanded consciousness rather than going down a destructive route. I go back to 1929 and the debate between Martin Heidegger and Ernst Cassirer, where on the one hand you had got a clear sense of reason and order and empirical observation. The other, you had got a sense of limited finitude, subjectivity, and destruction. And that kind of paradox, of that kind of disjunction between the two kind of debaters in Davos all those years ago, is reflected in the way the bifurcation of the human psyche. And we really need to resolve that. This is what I take from some of your contributions, because if we can't resolve the conflict within ourselves, accommodate our own shadow, then we will project that shadow onto the world. And that is part of what I think is happening. This has been a fabulous discussion. I'm tempted to say we should actually start this all over again once we've got the results of this discussion today. But I'm gonna turn back to Indy. You've stimulated us, Indy, as you always do, with your brilliance and your vision. I think if we could actually find some ways to make that real, given all the complexities that we do face, the obstacles we do face, we at least have a way forward. Because one of my frustrations of working in peace building for the last 30 years is one is always in a power down situation. You're trying to correct a deficit rather than create an affirmative, positive, resource action forward. And I think you've given us that, which I think is just really powerful. But what do you have any reflections on the discussion, and where would you like to take it next?
Firstly, just been an honor to be in this room, and so many brilliant minds and so many brilliant contributions. Few things that sort of come to mind, and I think, Deirdre, what you pointed out, water glacier systems is not about glacier systems. So what you're seeing is soot from industrial factories land on the glacier systems, accelerate the melting of those systems, and actually exacerbate the volatility of the systems. So this is about the glacier, it's about the deforestation, it's about the agricultural systems, it's about the industrial systems that we're building, and the regressive feedback loops that we're driving into the systems. And I think whether you take soil, whether you take water, what you find is that there's system vulnerability, and the fragility is actually at foundational level. Loss of energy, water, any of these things, they become tipping points to set up cascading conflicts, especially if you have high proximity, multiple divergent needs on those common goods. So I think the point that you made there is really important, because I also think it's a capability question. So one of the questions we're right now talking to the World Bank about is around how do societies make decisions together? I think one of the fundamental problems that we face is our capacity of societies to make decisions, i.e. to sense make, and inform, is fundamentally not fit for purpose. Be able to actually operate in the landscape of prevention of future harm. So I agree with what Andrew said. This is not a science problem anymore. It's also a problem of how we as societies organize into decision. Representative democracy no longer has the representative sovereignty, to operate through delegation. This is why Andrew's point about consumer behaviors becomes really important, because it's rooted in different ways. So I think one of the things that's really critical is to recognize that these are entangled solution spaces. They're not hydrological or soil. There are these flows that need to be addressed. But the locations and their vulnerabilities are systemic. I think silently also what's really important to recognize is that the tri-party vulnerability that exists, say, in the Himalayas is not a tri-party vulnerability. It's also a four-dimensional vulnerability of a foreign party that wishes to destabilize those civilizations, could actively accelerate that crisis. So it's in an interest with an outward-facing risk to stabilize those environments. So it's really interesting how these dynamics are being played out, and that's also true in some of the African context that I think was being laid out. I think these things are moving. So that's the other thing I would say. The security logics around these things are now becoming well into the into the domains of comprehension. I think some of the conversations we're seeing in terms of the net zero transition is increasingly moving towards a security transition logic. So we're seeing the logic start to shift. If those logics become entirely defensible, bounded, they will become a source of a systemic problem. So our ability to frame shift there is going to be critical in being able to orchestrate that. Locations around the world are opening up for these sorts of vulnerabilities and these sorts of needs. They need new types of institutional design and development. And I think what was also rooted out is that this requires new forms of many-to-many agreement spaces. Construction of many-to-many agreements is a vital part for the construction of legitimate systems in this model. And how do we come to agreement in that space, I think, is a key function. So what we're seeing is locations open up around all of this stuff in multiple environments. And I think what the question becomes for me is how we start to sensitively operate into those environments and sensitively start to build these transnational proofs. And I think there's a demand for it now on the ground. It has a different voice and a different language and a different system, requires new types of capabilities to build into that work, but it's necessary. But it does require the security logic because that's what brings, I would say, the red mindset to the table for a generative future. So, and I wanted to say the other point was that I think what's right is the inner work is really vital, but also we can change the inner by changing the outer. There's a reciprocal relationships. And I think we're going to have to now do the outer. So if we can go from a security, an entangled theory of security, we take a red mindset and be able to turn that into a mutual development mindset. And that is totally out of enlightened self-interest. So all I'm expanding there is the theory of self-interest to map the scale of vulnerability. And so I'm now rooting this into a very what I call self-centered mindsets, but actually building the scope of interest to allow it to become entangled to build this. So the politics of this, as a small p politics, I think is really important construction, as well as the other layers that I've discussed. And it's such an honor to have so much wisdom in this room, and brilliance and perspectives in that. So just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Indy. Just one addition to that. I think Hannah put a really interesting point in the chat, which is could we start this in certain places? Would there be open to experiment places that she's listed some places that are open to experimentation? Because the quicker we can make this real, the better. If we can get something going, even if it's not perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been really illuminating for me. I hope that you feel the same, and I hope that we can kind of reflect the team that put this together, particularly Tamsin, Jerry, and Tom and others, can reflect on this and maybe reformulate and come back to this topic, because I think it's too important to leave. We've started something. There is, in my mind, a kind of coherence in the discussion. Really, some powerful individual contributions to this. As Indy said, some brilliant minds on this, including his. And thank you, Indy, for leading us through such what is a perilous time for us all, really, and for our children and our children's children. There's a lot at stake here. I can't imagine there has been a time when the world has been people in the world are taking so many risks with themselves. So anyway, wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is with you, I hope the rest of your day is as good as the last hour and a half has been. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Indy. And I will share the recording in the chat with everybody.
Thank you, everybody, from me.